The call came on a Thursday morning, just before I left for my shift at the library. My daughter-in-law's voice was bright, the way expensive things are. Bright, polished, hard, nothing warm underneath it. She said, "We thought it would be lovely if you came to the rehearsal dinner." Casual, of course, very casual. I knew what casual meant when she said it. It meant, "Don't embarrass us." I said I'd be there. I put the phone down and stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at the window above the sink. The glass needed cleaning. There was a smudge from last winter where I'd pressed my palm against it during a snowstorm, watching the birch trees bend. I never got around to wiping it off. Some days I liked having it there. I'm 63 years old. My name is Gloria Sutherland-Beck, and for most of my adult life, nobody in my family knew what I was worth. That's not an accident. It was a decision I made a long time ago, and I made it carefully, and I never regretted it until my son's wedding weekend. And even then, I'm not sure regret is the right word for what I felt. Maybe something closer to grief. The particular grief of watching a person you love choose to be smaller than you raised them to be. My son, I'll call him by what he is to me. My son is 31 years old. He grew up in our house in Sudbury, in a neighborhood where the driveways were cracked and the kids played road hockey until the streetlights came on. His father and I divorced when he was 9. I went back to work full-time, bookkeeping for a string of small businesses along the main strip. By the time my son was in high school, I was managing accounts for 17 clients on my own. He doesn't remember the years when we ate a lot of pasta and not much else. He was too young. But I remember them. What I built after that, I built quietly. My clients trusted me, and I trusted numbers. Numbers don't lie to you the way people can. I started putting money into index funds in the mid-90s, when most people I knew were still keeping their savings in GICs at the credit union. I bought a duplex in Sudbury in 2003 for $212,000. I bought another property in Sault Ste. Marie in 2008 during the crash, when everyone else was too frightened to move. I kept my own apartment modest. I kept my car modest. I kept everything modest because I had watched enough of my clients spend money they didn't have on things they didn't need, and I wanted no part of that particular story. By the time my son finished his MBA at Dalhousie, I was worth approximately $4.3 million. He did not know this. He knew I was comfortable. He knew I owned some property, but the full picture, the investment accounts, the real estate portfolio, the fact that I had been quietly, methodically building something for 30 years that I kept to myself. I kept it to myself because I wanted him to work for his own life. I wanted him to know what it felt like to earn something. I'd seen what happened to children who grew up knowing exactly what they were inheriting. I'd done the books for enough of those families. His girlfriend, who became his fiancée, who became his wife, I'll call her what she was to me, my daughter-in-law, came from a family in Oakville. Her father ran a commercial real estate firm. Her mother sat on the board of 2 charitable foundations and wore her pearls like armor. They had a lake house in Muskoka. They had a wine cellar. They had opinions about things like caterers and invitation paperweight that I genuinely did not understand. The first time I met them, at a dinner in Toronto, my daughter-in-law's mother looked at my blazer, which was perfectly nice. I'd had it for years and it was good wool, and said, "Oh, how practical." The way she said it was a kind of summary of me, of where I came from, of what she thought my son was adding to their family. I smiled and asked her about the wine. People like that always want to talk about the wine. I watched my son at that dinner. I watched how he straightened when her father spoke, how he laughed a little too readily at the father's jokes, how he stopped finishing his sentences the way he used to, with that slight upturn, checking to see if I agreed, and started finishing them by glancing at his future father-in-law instead. I drove back to Sudbury that night, and I told myself it was normal. That young men adjust. That love makes people orbit new centers of gravity. I told myself a lot of things on that 4-hour drive. The wedding was set for late September, up at the family's Muskoka property. Tents, a string quartet catered from a restaurant in Toronto. My daughter-in-law sent me a detailed email about the weekend schedule. There was a note at the bottom that said, "Dress code is garden formal. Let me know if you have any questions about what that means." The exclamation mark was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I knew what it meant. I went to a consignment shop in the Glebe in Ottawa. I was down there for a conference and found a dove gray dress that was beautiful, genuinely beautiful, fitted silk with a small ruffle at the hem. $45. I know quality when I see it. The woman who sold it to me said it had come from an estate sale. I thought, this dress has history. That appealed to me. I also brought a gift. This is where it starts. This is the part I've turned over in my mind more times than I can count since September. I had in my possession a Canada savings bond I'd purchased in 1998, face value of $500. I'd bought it the year my son was born. I'd bought several actually over the year, intending to give them to him at meaningful moments. I'd given him the others at his high school graduation, at convocation. This was the last one. I'd held on to it because the moment hadn't felt right yet. A 25-year-old Canada savings bond, depending on the series, can be worth considerably more than its face value. This particular bond, I'd checked before the wedding, had matured to just under $4,000. Not a fortune, but not nothing. And more than that, it was the last one. It meant something to me. I wanted him to have it and know what it meant. I put it in an envelope with a note that explained exactly what it was and what it was worth and why I'd kept it. I wrote the note by hand, 3 drafts, on proper stationery. I sealed it and brought it to the rehearsal dinner. The rehearsal dinner was at the boathouse. Everything was lanterns and linen and the kind of effortless beauty that costs an enormous amount of money to make look effortless. I sat at the far end of the table. I'd been seated, I noticed, between my son's university friend who I'd never met and an elderly great-aunt of the bride who had a hearing aid that whistled softly every 40 seconds. After dinner, my son's father-in-law made a toast. He talked about his daughter's accomplishments. He talked about my son's potential. He said, generously, that he was looking forward to welcoming both families together, and he gestured at me when he said this, and I felt the particular warmth of being included as an afterthought. Then there were gifts. Apparently, this was a thing now. Gifts at rehearsal dinners. I did not know this was a thing. I produced my envelope. My daughter-in-law opened it in front of everyone. She read the card. There was a pause that lasted perhaps 2 full seconds, but felt considerably longer. Then she held up the bond and said, in a voice that carried, "And the boathouse had good acoustics, a savings bond? Is this from the 90s? She laughed. It was a small laugh, the kind that apologizes for itself while still insisting on happening. My son was sitting beside her. He looked at me. I looked at him. He said, and I have heard this sentence in my sleep since September. I have heard it on the drive to work and in the quiet before I fall asleep. He said, "Mum, you could have just gotten something from the registry." That was it. That was all. He didn't defend the gift. He didn't explain what a matured savings bond is worth. He didn't say anything about what that bond might mean. He just offered me, gently, the opportunity to have done something more appropriate. I put my napkin on the table. I said, "You're right. I'll know for next time." I picked up my purse and I said goodnight to the people nearest me, and I went back to the cottage they'd arranged for the overflow guests, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I looked at the wall for a long time. I did not cry. I'm not sure why. I think I was too tired. In the morning, I went to the wedding. I wore the gray dress and I sat in the second row and I watched my son marry a woman who thought I was a figure to be managed. And I smiled when the photographs were taken, and I ate the dinner, and I danced once with my son's oldest friend and once by myself at the edge of the tent when a song came on that his father and I used to like. I drove home on Sunday. The following Tuesday, I called my financial advisor in Toronto. Her name is not relevant, but she's been working with me for 11 years and she is very good at her job. I told her I wanted to begin restructuring my estate plan. I told her I wanted to establish a family trust. Not in my son's name, in mine. I wanted to change the beneficiary designations on my investment accounts. I wanted to have a conversation about what a revised will might look like, and I wanted to do it properly and carefully and without drama. She said, "How soon do you want to start?" I said, "I'm already started." What followed was 3 months of paperwork, meetings, and very methodical thinking. I'm a bookkeeper by trade. I am not impulsive. I did not do any of this in anger, though I want to be honest, there was anger somewhere underneath the precision. I just didn't let it drive. I restructured the trust so that the properties, the duplex in Sudbury, the Salt-Stay Dar, Marie building, 2 additional units I'd acquired in 2017 in Timmins. All of it sat within a family trust of which I am the sole trustee. I changed the beneficiary on my RRSP and my TFSA. I reviewed the life insurance policy. I also, quietly, stopped paying for several things I had been paying for without announcement. I had been covering my son's car insurance. It was not a large amount, just over $140 a month. But I'd started doing it when he was a student, and I'd never stopped. And he didn't know because it came out of an account he didn't monitor. I stopped that in October. I had been paying for the streaming services on a family plan, 3 platforms, gone in October. I had been co-signed on a credit line he'd opened when he finished his degree, a backup he'd never used. I had my name removed from that in November. It required a call to the bank and some paperwork. No drama. Done. None of these things hurt him. That was not the point. The point was that I was looking clearly at what I had been quietly doing for years, propping things up, filling in gaps, saying nothing, and deciding which of those things I was continuing to choose. I chose differently. My son called in November. He said things had been busy. He asked how I was. He said my daughter-in-law sent her love, and I could hear in the way he said it that she had not specifically said this, and he was adding it as a kind of social mortar. I told him I was well. I told him I'd been doing some estate planning. He made a vague noise of acknowledgement, the way people do when they hear a word like estate and assume it doesn't concern them yet. I didn't correct him. December arrived. I drove down to Toronto for Christmas because they'd moved there after the wedding. Her family's city, her family's orbit, as I had known it would be. They had a new condo in Liberty Village. Very nice, very white, the kind of apartment where everything is a decision. My daughter-in-law had decorated it beautifully. I acknowledged this sincerely because it was true. Christmas morning, my son gave me a gift card to a spa. My daughter-in-law gave me a candle. I gave them a card and told them their gift was coming separately. My daughter-in-law smiled and moved. What came separately, a week later, was a letter from my solicitor. It was a formal notification that I was reviewing and restructuring my estate, that certain prior assumptions about inheritance should not be relied upon, and that I would be in touch directly when the process was complete. My son called within 24 hours of receiving it. He said, "Mom, what is this?" I said, "It's exactly what it says it is." He said, "Are you angry about the wedding?" I said, "I'm not angry, sweetheart. I'm clear." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Was it the bond?" I said, "It started with the bond, but it wasn't only the bond. A savings bond from 1998, the last one I had, the one I kept for you specifically, is worth approximately $4,000 today. I know you didn't know that. I know your wife didn't know that. But you could have defended it. You could have said, 'Let's look at this later.' You could have said anything other than what you said." He was quiet again. A longer quiet this time. He said, "I know." We stayed on the phone for 2 hours that evening. He told me things I hadn't known, that he had felt for a long time like he was failing to be enough for her family, that he'd been performing a version of himself he didn't entirely recognize, that the person he felt most like himself with was still me, still our Sunday calls and our kitchen table, and the way I taught him to read a balance sheet at age 14. He cried a little, my son. He hasn't cried in front of me since he was a teenager. I didn't tell him about the full extent of what I was worth. I'm still not sure he needs to know that yet. What I told him was that I loved him, that I would always love him, and that love was not the same thing as silence. That I had been quiet for too long about what I needed from him, and that needed to change. I also told him that the savings bond was currently sitting on my kitchen table. He said, "You still have it?" I said, "I picked it up on my way out of the boathouse." Another long pause. He said, "Mum." I said, "I know. There are things still being worked out, The estate plan is not finalized. My relationship with my daughter-in-law is not repaired. I'm not sure repair is even what I'm aiming for. What I'm aiming for is honesty, which is different. She and I had coffee in February, just the two of us, at a place near their condo. She told me she hadn't meant the comment about the bond to be hurtful. I believed her, actually. I don't think she meant it. I think she reacted out of ignorance and embarrassment and a lifetime of being surrounded by people who measured everything in obvious ways. I told her that the note inside the envelope, which she hadn't read aloud, had explained the bond's history and its value. She asked if she could read it now. I said the note was not available, but that I'd be glad to tell her what it said. She listened. When I finished, she looked at her coffee cup for a while and then said, "I didn't know you were like this." I said, "Like what?" She said, "Like someone who thinks carefully about things." I didn't know what to do with that sentence at first. And then I thought, this is where it starts. Not repaired. Just started. My son came up to Sudbury in March, alone. We spent the weekend the way we used to, badly beaten at Scrabble, long walks, cooking things that take too long. He asked me carefully about the estate restructuring. I told him it was ongoing and that it was mine to manage. He said he understood. He said he was sorry. Not for the letter, not for any specific thing, but sorry in the large, undifferentiated way that sometimes means everything. I put the savings bond in the middle of the kitchen table between us. I said, "This is still yours. It always was, but you're going to have to do something to earn it back, and I don't mean anything financial." He looked at it for a long time. He said, "What do I have to do?" I said, "Be the person I know you are. The rest will follow." He took the bond and put it in his jacket pocket. We played Scrabble until midnight. He won the second game, which I allowed and will deny. I drove him to the station on Sunday morning. It was cold, the kind of cold that comes off Lake Huron and gets into everything. And we stood on the platform and he hugged me for a long time before the train came. Not the quick shoulder squeeze he'd been giving me for the past few years. A real one. I drove back through town and stopped at Tim Hortons for a coffee. I sat at the window table with my medium double-double and watched the parking lot and thought about the duplex on Lawrence Street, which is currently renting well, and the one on Spruce, and the units in the Salt, and the investments, and the trust documents in the filing cabinet at home, and the gray silk dress in my closet that still has a little tag that says $5 more than I paid for it because the woman at the consignment shop knocked off the extra. I thought about my son's face at the kitchen table, and I thought, this is what patience looks like, not weakness, not forgiveness as surrender. Patience that knows its own worth and knows, also, when to be still and when to move. I finished my coffee. I had a good drive home. I still have things I haven't told him. Some of them he'll find out eventually, through the trust, through the will, through the way life unfolds these things in its own time. Some of them he already knows, in the way sons know things about their mothers. Not in facts, but in the marrow of what they learned growing up. He knows, for instance, that I have never wasted a single thing I was given. He knows that the most powerful move is often the quietest one. He knows that a savings bond from 1998, held carefully for 25 years, is worth more than anyone at that table thought. And he knows, I believe he knows, that so am I. I've thought a lot about what that evening at the boathouse actually cost me, not the bond. $4,000 is $4,000, and money I've always been able to account for. What it cost me was something harder to put a number on, the assumption I'd been carrying for 30 years that the way I raised my son would be enough, that the values I'd tried to plant in him, patience, honesty, the understanding that a thing's worth has nothing to do with how it looks, would hold up under the pressure of a new life and new people and a table full of lanterns and linen. They didn't hold up. Not that night, and here's what I've come to understand about that. It wasn't a failure of my son's character, not entirely. It was a failure of my silence. I had spent so long building quietly, the properties, the accounts, the life I made from 30 years of careful, unglamorous work. and I had built my relationship with my son on the same principle, quietly, assuming it was solid, never testing it out loud. That's not wisdom. That's avoidance dressed up as patience. What I know now is that the people we love don't become who we hoped they'd be through inheritance. They become it through friction, through being called back, gently and honestly, to the version of themselves they've started to drift away from. I should have been doing that for years. Instead, I kept driving 4 hours home from dinners where I'd been dismissed, telling myself it was normal, that he'd find his way, that I didn't need to say anything because the truth would eventually be obvious. The truth is never just obvious. You have to be willing to say it. My son, when we finally talked, really talked, on the phone for 2 hours in November, he said the thing that stayed with me the most. He said the person he felt most like himself with was still me, still our kitchen table, still the way I'd shown him, years ago, how to read what numbers actually say about a life. He'd been performing a different version of himself for so long that he'd almost forgotten that other version existed. That's what happens when we choose belonging over honesty. We lose track of ourselves, and the people who love us most can see it happening. But if they stay quiet, if I stay quiet, nobody says a word, and the drift continues, and one day a savings bond becomes a symbol of everything that went unspoken. I'm not interested in bitterness. I never have been. What I restructured was not a punishment. It was a recalibration, a decision to stop building a future around assumptions and start building it around clarity. The bond is still with my son. It's in his jacket pocket or somewhere safe by now, I hope. He earned it back, not by doing anything grand, but by showing up to Sudbury in March and sitting at my kitchen table and being, for a whole weekend, completely and honestly himself. That's the only thing I've ever actually asked of him. And if you're listening to this and you recognize something in it, the quiet accumulation, the swallowed words, the moment where someone you love chose the wrong thing and you didn't know what to say, I'd ask you to consider whether the silence has been protecting the relationship or just postponing the conversation it actually needs. In my experience, the things we build in silence eventually have to be spoken out loud. That's not a threat. That's just how it works.